I'm okay.
I, I miss just having access to my friend.
Well, we just need to keep at it again. So,
Okay.
um, yeah, things are getting back to normal.
Whatever that word, that's a word that shouldn't be used easily.
No, I feel much better than I have in months.
Wonderful.
I
Fabulous.
doing chemo twice a day for forever, probably, um,
Okay.
but
Do you like the poetry book I sent you?
I didn't get a poetry book.
I sent you a PDF
Oh,
my,
when did you?
weeks ago. I'll send it again.
Mm.
A dear friend of mine of blessed memory, Debbie, wrote modern psalms, and many are for healing in the
Oh,
circumstance of chemotherapy. I'll send it
yes,
again.
yeah. I don't see that here.
I'll send it again.
Okay. Um. So Joseph, um, I want you to imagine a hypothetical, a situation where um, the law is being just flagrantly violated left and right, and people of faith are um, vice signaling on social media channels, and uh, in, and just unserious people do things with consequences. Be damned. So
You
just
want me to
imagine.
you want me to imagine that.
Um, so just if such a time and place existed, it might be appropriate to have a conversation about um, how you and I and our respective traditions understand God's moral intent.
And it occurs not once, it occurs in Exodus 20, occurs again in Deuteronomy 6, it occurs in Leviticus 19, it occurs in Deuteronomy 34. This is the purpose of redemption from slavery. Redemption from slavery was not intended as liberty, thanks, bye. It was very clearly, you are slaves, and now I'm going to ask you to come and worship me. And the same word in Hebrew, the same word, avodah, is used for slavery, oppressive labor, and worship.
Hmm. Yep.
And where do they engage in that commitment? Mount Sinai, a mountain in the desert wilderness. So it's not private, it's not personal, it's public and communal. It's
Yep.
for everybody. Wow. And those are called, and we will read it in synagogues all over the world this Saturday, comes in this week's Torah portion. It's revelation.
Hmm.
And your buddy Paul notwithstanding, we are meant as human beings to engage in the burden, responsibility, and glory, in my opinion, of heteronomy. It might be ultimately I've come to fulfill the law, but we're not there yet.
Hmm.
We're still engaged in. So the rabbis say that the people standing at Sinai only heard the first letter of the first word.
Hmm.
And the first letter of the first word, I am the Lord your God, took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. That is not a commandment. That is the prologue.
Yeah.
And the first word in Egyptian, Anochi. And they only heard the first letter of the first word, which is an aleph. Here it comes. It's a silent letter. And the rabbis define humankind's experience of God's revelation of the law as hearing silence.
Hmm.
And they experienced it. And then, quote, the 10 utterances, the 10 things. We don't share the same text. We don't share the same translation. And that tragically gets to your request that I imagine a time when people have decided, in the name of the law, to discard the very thing that should motivate them. For instance, because I did so much work in HIV/AIDS in rural India, I know there are people dying today because US aid has been shut down. And it says you should not murder. It does not say you should not kill. It says murder. Lo tirtzach.
A loophole.
Well, is it a loophole? King James Version English notwithstanding, we know that language is meant to differentiate what human beings often forget. Wars involve killing. And there are more wars and killing in the Hebrew Bible than any book I know. But murder, the killing of innocent human beings, that's different. I recently explained to someone the attack on October 7th was an act of calculated intentional murder.
Mhm.
The war that has followed that attack on October 7th is a war which has tragically, egregiously been prosecuted so that innocents have been killed. That's the difference between the two words.
Before we get too further along, break down the meaning of the word Decalogue that church people, at least, may be
Yeah.
familiar with without knowing.
Well,
Not
here's, thank you, Augustine. Thank you, Paul. When you ask people, how many laws are there in the Bible? Most people with a reasonable amount of tragic ignorance say 10. And I applaud and say, you're only off by 603.
well,
Look,
what's fascinating. I was it's in Robert Jensen's systematic theology where he's making the point that the creation story itself begins with God uttering a command, "Let there be,"
yeah,
and it being obeyed. And so the back and forth of covenant is woven into the fabric of creation.
absolutely correct. Yes. So, Decalogue, again, we go from ancient Hebrew to the early intertestamental Greek Septuagint, initially written by assimilated Jews in Alexandria. That text is probably no longer extant. It became the Septuagint used by Christians. Then we go to the Vulgate, the Latin. Every time it's translated for use, it's interpreted.
Mhm.
By the time we get to the idea of a decalogue, we've decided these are the laws. As they're situated in different scriptural contexts, they're not even lined up the same way. So most Christians are confused when I say the first utterance is not a commandment. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. That's it. That they need to add the next part of a verse. you shall have no other gods in front of me, to create a commandment prohibition. This is God's purpose in redeeming ancient Israel. We need laws, limits, both ritual advance on moral relationships. Why do we need a quote commandment regarding honor mother and father?
Apparently, it was a problem.
Or it's an affirmation that the cornerstone institution of civilization is the family.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting that family and then the Sabbath. You need a discipline to engage in time, and maybe it's worthy of our effort to study Heschel. What does the Sabbath mean to all human beings of every kind? That's why that is in the 10 utterances. So, prologue, 2 prohibitions about idolatry, because Judaism, even in its biblical faith, is monotheism that requires constant guarding of idolatry and polytheism. I'm God, and by the way, I took you out of Egypt. You and I have a relationship of historical nature. I'm not God in a theological construct. I'm God as I've related to you in your idea of being who you are. You suffered, you cried, I heard you, and now here you are again. So it's Buberian from the outset, Levinausian. It's a relationship. Please do not give way to the idiocy, but always present necessity of being overstimulated by the physical, the nature of seeing and wanting to be around idols. I think it's as big a problem today as it ever was. We don't have totems, but we have credit cards, we have algorithms, we have other things that have attracted us and distracted us from the unseen, unseeable God who can only be encountered. Now we go to family and the Sabbath. So the first 5 utterances are positive about our being in covenant with one God. 2 prohibitions, family and time. Now we get to the universal mores. Murder, theft, but not theft in burglary, kidnapping. Don't kidnap. It's the worst kind of theft. Adultery, stop, parenthesis, men can only commit adultery insofar as they are having sexual relations with a married woman.
So if she's single,
it's not, and he's married, it's not adultery, because this is a polygamous culture. So if we want family values, we always need a bracket. The biblical understanding of adultery only relates to married women. It would be changed later in the nature of fidelity in marriage we all share today. But there are religions that permit polygamy. There is no religion that I'm aware of that permits polyandry.
Yeah, and I think this is important for Christians to understand, especially in traditions like my own that have gone through debates and divorces over sexuality. What you're pointing to is the reason why when Paul in the New Testament speaks of marriage, he's always making an analogy between Christ and the church. Um,
Correct.
Paul is not going back to the Old Testament and speaking of commandments. He's making analogies.
So when people in Louisiana, Oklahoma, want 10 commandments up everywhere, I don't inherently disagree. I want to know which translation and which biblical text.
Mm-hmm.
Exodus, Deuteronomy, because Exodus and Deuteronomy are not the same, and you know that. There's a difference between remember the Sabbath and keep the Sabbath.
I think you can even purchase for your house of worship a base for a flagpole for the American flag, and the base of it is the Ten Commandments.
Correct.
So it's
And I just, which one? So then we get to bearing false witness, which people tragically don't use my name in vain and bearing false witness. We have to be really careful about superimposing what we're sure the biblical text meant.
what about like stop the bullshit? Would that count as an appropriate translation?
That might be better rather than don't use a curse word in which God's name appears. No, it meant taking an oath, taking a vow for the purpose of engaging God when you intentionally know you're making a false promise. I swear to God, I'm going to keep my room clean. How many teenagers say that? Often. They don't mean it. We know they don't mean it. You can't engage God's name as collateral on an intentionally false promise. Don't
So
get me started with inaugurations.
So you're saying it's for the best that he didn't put his hand on the Bible.
Yes, because lightning might have engulfed everybody.
We should be so lucky.
I think all of us need to understand in the ancient world, promises made were assumed to be promises for which you are accountable.
Mm-hmm.
And we just don't have that anymore. It's meaningless for people to attempt to say, you see, he made a promise, he's doing what he promised, shut up.
So in that section from Jensen that I mentioned a few minutes ago, where he talks about the creation story starting with God issuing a command and it being obeyed, he then goes to say, it would seem to follow from this that not to obey God's commandments is not to be. It would seem further to follow that if I once am disobedient, I cannot again obey, there now being no one there to do so. And these are indeed the drastic truths of Scripture. Sin is death, and renewal of obedience demands nothing less than recreation.
Yes, I understand and appreciate a Christian theology that then embraces the promise of the risen Christ as the solution to that problem.
Mm-hmm.
I, as a Jew, remain in covenant with the same God you've just interpreted, but I'm engaged in the ongoing struggle of I'm going to continue to strive for the commandments, reinterpreting them, explaining them to a new generation, and re-engaging in the responsibility of those commandments.
Mm-hmm.
Bearing false witness is different than using God's name in vain because it very seriously takes the nature of being a witness. The issue is not merely perjury. It, I think, today has to do with the burden of being present and seeing and remaining silent.
Yeah.
I think the quote flooding of the zone is calculated, orchestrated, and all of us now are witnessing, and it's too much. And we're coping with learning how to tolerate the intolerable, and then somehow grading which intolerable is more intolerable. And I think it's all been calculated. So on any given day, okay, we were able to get rid of that attorney general nominee. So this one, it's at least acceptable. We're really going forward with a guy who denies vaccines. Oh my God. On and on and on. And there's so much. How much can you witness? And I think, myself included, for the sake of health and sanity, I've withdrawn. So, what does it mean today to bear false witness? I think we need to struggle with not only the commandment and its meaning and interpretation, but how do we hold each other accountable for being present, witnessing it? And then, well, what do I do with this information now? It will be soon that his administration's budget and his economic plan and huge tax cut, in my opinion, makes clear why USAID has been disbanded. It was the lowest hanging fruit of the biggest amount of money to balance out what he wants.
So you said the Torah portion for this this week is the 10 sayings.
Yes.
Here, I'll give you a snapshot of the Revised Common Lectionary for Christians.
Okay.
Cursed are those who trust in mere mortals. That's Jeremiah 17. The Psalm passage is Psalm 1. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers. Luke 6, woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. That's Jesus speaking, if you didn't know that already. And then finally, Paul's crescendo in 1 Corinthians. If for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. Which I think is a way of saying, nihilism begets sin.
Interesting. It would be fascinating to, the portion itself is called Yitro and begins with Moses requiring the help of Jethro, his Midianite priest father-in-law. It's immediately following crossing the Sea of Reeds. The Egyptians have been engulfed and destroyed, and people are now just consuming Moses. I mean, he doesn't have a moment to himself. Do you know what that means, Pastor? So Jethro says, you're not going to make it. You need 70 elders that you train, you deputize. They're going to have to go out and work among the people for you to do what you need to do. I think it's amazing that the 10 utterances, is embodied in a portion, series of chapters named for a non-Israelite.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, chapter 19, the so called theophany, the experience of revelation, now the content of revelation. And where do we find this? In a portion in which the Midianite priest is mentoring his son in law. I think the Bible gives us examples of the paradox that's needed to survive.
Mm. Mm.
Leaders who do not raise up those to help leadership, who don't raise up governance, cannot do it alone, current circumstances notwithstanding.
So, I'm curious, Joseph. We haven't had a chance to talk. As a Jew, how excited are you for Gaza to be turned into a Mar-a-Lago resort on the Mediterranean?
I cannot tell you how sleepless it's been for all the excitement I feel. My daughter, who works for the New York Times, called me very upset and worried. We'd had some difficult conversations about should media give Hamas clear, obvious propaganda time.
Mm-hmm.
Because the exchange of hostages has been absolute Goebbels handbook propaganda, right out of his head.
Yeah. So one consequence of the zone being flooded with shit is actual stories of consequence get lost in the news. So back up a little bit and unpack what you're talking about.
Every Saturday for the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks, hostages that have been imprisoned, kidnapped by Hamas since October 7th are freed. They're given a swag bag, a goodie bag. They're given a certificate. And last week, a Hamas cameraman instructs one of the hostages to wave to the crowd. It's a level of such indecency, I don't have enough words to scream. And my daughter calls and says, well, what should a media site do? Should we stage what they've done, which is propaganda for their community? Or don't you think the world should see that? I think that's a profound question. Mm-hmm. What do you do when you're a witness to such indecency? So when he says, I'm going to own Gaza, Israel is going to give it to me, and it'll be ours, and you all have to leave. I don't know at what point have I stopped understanding reality when he is so outlandish and vulgar. I'm going to move 2.2 million human beings out of what they were told is theirs, and I am going to own this. Because
you do hope that prospective terrorists know that they're supposed to take them seriously, but not literally.
Correct. So I cried as I imagined being the family of the emaciated hostages being told to wave. It's a vulgarity. Oh my God. Uh-huh. So does this feed the rage of a Netanyahu who says, I'm going in, and how much more can you destroy?
Yeah.
So what are we to do? Are we bearing false witness when we deny the orphans who no longer have a home in Gaza City? I think that's a real question. They too are the victims of Hamas. Are we bearing false witness when we allow two presidents to talk to each other with the exclusion of a victim whose country was invaded and life has been destroyed?
Yeah.
You'll take what we give you.
Speculate a little bit if you can, Joseph. So the 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 once and again president's comments about um, turning Gaza into a resort destination have not triggered chants of genocide. Don, there aren't campus protests um, all over the country. Um, there hasn't been any sort of organized outrage by Islamic communities in Michigan. Um, how do you account for that?
I don't know. I have asked myself that question regarding other circumstances. I don't know why the streets were not filled with all that he did regarding transgender rights. It, bit by bit, week by week, and then the grand finale, the banning of less than 10 human beings from being trans athletes at the less than 10 human beings, a room filled with women and girls, all done to stigmatize less than 10 human beings. And why were the streets not immediately full? This is exactly what happened in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a parallel, it's exact. So your question, why have not all far left pro-Palestinians converged in a lava of rage? I don't know. It's winter. I don't know. Are they afraid? Yeah, I think you have a lot of people on campus who now are afraid. I think his threats, I think foreign students, I think we've entered into, there's a rapidity that has created a kind of disbelief every day, sometimes several times a day. How, if I told you that someone like RFK would become the Secretary of Health and Human Services, there are moments of disbelief that help explain what I call indifference. But I don't know how to say all those pro-Palestinians are now indifferent. That doesn't make any more sense than how come they're not as enraged now as they were 8 months ago? So what is happening? Does he say outlandish things? So we're in utter disbelief. And when we're in utter disbelief, he can get something else done. Was the former congressman from Florida never meant to be attorney general, but a calculated distraction? He won't stop until he's stopped.
Yeah.
And
in that count, so again, this is Robert Jensen. I think this is a good point. He writes, "It is the commandment's predominant negativity that we must first observe at this point. The second table of the law is not to create human community, but to protect it. And the crimes that destroy community are everywhere drearily the same. Thus, the second table protects the sexual and generational structure of every community's basis, the family. It protects necessary mutual peace and legality. It protects the integrity of a wider household, including property. And it protects the communal rather than private status of such a household.
Bravo! That's
hold,
it.
Hold on. Just so, room is left for the specific moral character of Israel or the church to be otherwise determined. Whereas the negative commands can apply to communities of whatever sort, the character of an actual community is created by its specific history. Communities do not live by avoiding crimes, they cohere and create by the virtues cultivated in their distinctive histories. To the crime of murder, for example, could be opposed one or more of many virtues: compassion, or rectitude, or generosity. Virtues are posited by the memory of the history that has made the community, by telling of the founding and the ancestors and the promised destiny.
Brilliant. It's why those second five are called mores.
Mhm.
They are shared. I don't even like the word universal. They are shared human needs.
Mhm.
And that's why I argue vigorously it's do not commit murder, not do not kill. Because if it's do not kill, you have an inconsistency that strips the entire list of any credibility.
And I think, um, for Christians, the gospel is a promise, but you you can't proclaim that promise in such a way as you make it sound as though Jesus rescued us from the burden of being Christians. Um,
Being human.
and
No,
I
but
do think,
that's what I think you read Jensen to say. This is a set of human necessities
yeah,
that leaves room for what the church and synagogue will eventually interpret in their own context.
yeah. I mean, because Dietrich Bonhoeffer has an essay that I think, um, I don't know if you have this equivalent in Christianity. We have someone like Bonhoeffer who was a martyr, and so therefore he is well known, and he's often cited, but I don't think actually read. um, and
Yes.
so Christians will talk about cheap grace all the time, but I don't think they've actually read the book where because they always misuse the phrase. But anyway, a more important work of Bonhoeffer's is an essay called "The Ultimate and the Penultimate," and so he talks about the responsibility of the church um, is to advocate and work towards um, healthy and virtuous structures of society so that, for example, the poor can be in a position to hear the promise of the gospel. Um,
Mhm.
that it's hard to hear the story of Israel if you're starving to death. And so so it's the society exists to bring people in to the people of Abraham.
I don't know. It's not yet a month, and I am trying to be healthy. I don't know how much more I can stop, say I'm not going to get engaged in this because I can't go anywhere with it. What
Hmm.
will when I was engaged in issues like civil rights, the war in Vietnam, issues of the LGBTQ, when I did all that and HIV/AIDS, I could keep a focus because I shared discourse. My fear every day is I don't understand the discourse others are using.
Mm. And I think one thing I've thought about too, and I guess this relates to like bearing truthful witness. So it's also true, that so as a church, we have had to do a lot of communication at our mission center about immigration because of the clients that we serve, and that's necessary and appropriate on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's true that um, what is different about this administration's immigration policy right now is just that they're publicizing it better. That you know Obama's ICE didn't go around videotaping rounding up immigrants. and detaining them, and Trump. So yeah, so it's there are these issues where it's easy to get tangled up in partisanship
Mhm,
unintentionally.
mhm. And the extreme nature of that partisanship, we've talked about this before. The mutual difference in the extremes is to make sure anything in the center is vacated.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
That sustains the power on both extremes.
yeah.
The last of the Acerta de Brot, covet. How much do you think you need to explain the word covet instead of obsessively be jealous? Because the nature of the commandment is a preventive prohibition so that you don't kidnap, steal, murder.
Yeah, I've thought about this recently. I listened to an interview with a woman who wrote a book on social media silos and algorithms, and the nature of the internet and social media, to put at your fingertips and eyeballs, um, myriad lives, uh, myriad lives that are better than yours or appear better than yours. Lots and lots of,
Intentionally.
yeah,
Intentionally.
lots of influencers and friends and followers who have stuff that you don't have, and how invariably covetousness leads to uh, bitterness and resentment and anger.
And some people then try to go out and get,
Hmm.
fill in the means of getting what I want. And now we can add something new that the text in the Bible couldn't add. You're not entitled to any of it. That that's what we have to help, especially our adult children, see. Yes, it's there. Oh, a 13-year-old influencer is a multimillionaire. Yes, that, but that's not reality. It's created in order to stimulate visually and algorithms your limits. You have a different body shape. You don't have the access to money. But I want, yes, you do want. I understand you want. I don't know why she has and you don't have. And it leads to misery.
Okay, so put the commandments in conversation since we talked about social media. Um, put the commandments in conversation with online pornography, which seems to be a problem for how people think about intimacy and sexuality from the perspective of Torah.
I think it's a profound question, and I won't do it merely and only with the issue of sex. I made the mistake of seeing a movie that's up for best film, uh,
Honora,
Honora.
we took our kids to see it on Thanksgiving.
Oh, that was interesting. I don't get it. I don't think it should be awarded anything. Uh, the young actress, I'm not offended by it, except its simplicity and stupidity. It doesn't ask questions. But I'm not a movie critic. I don't think it's just OnlyFans or Pornhub. Those are very serious, dangerous, overstimulating, and addictive. They're not reality, and they're misleading not just young people, but adults into what the human body is meant to be. Now, I have to also add, I struggle with a person who lays claim to the autonomy of making that choice.
Mm.
Does someone have the right to say, okay, you chose to be ordained, teach at a university, I choose to do this? I struggle with that. I'm not sure I agree with what that means with the harm you're doing and might be done to you that you're unaware of.
So, in the context of Honora, what I appreciated about it is that the movie ends with her crying.
Yes. The last scene might in fact redeem it through the act of a non-consensual domain of intimacy.
That yeah. So for people unfamiliar, Honora is a sex worker who is hired um, by a Russian oligarch's son to be his partner for a week.
And the
And then
movie involves lap dances, money, alcohol, drugs, more money, lots of screaming, some I think
but
Richard.
the movie start but so like for most of the movie you could make an argument that she is exercising agency. um
Correct.
but the movie ends with no, actually this is damaged her.
So I want to go back and ask a question that we need to ask about social media, digital platforms. That is a first order question to Pornhub. Why didn't we collectively stop digital influencers before they were accepted as a value?
Mhm.
Why didn't we and this goes back to why aren't the pro-Palestinians out on the street? Why didn't we say the minute the word influencer was used, no, that's not accept, no, we don't know.
Well, it's kind of like, how come we didn't regulate cigarettes earlier?
Okay, so is that the question that all religion has been asking? I needed to make sure, after I told you who I am, I needed you to hear my prohibition about all the things that stimulate you. That's what the prohibitions on idolatry are about. You're just human. I understand that. So here's everything that's going to stimulate you. Don't do it. Because that stimulation will come between us.
Well, and it's interesting, even just the phrase "I'm only human" um, it implies a natural state that Scripture contradicts.
Mm-hmm. Because we're only human, which permits us the possibility of striving toward being more than human.
Yeah, that for Christians at least, like you are made in the image of Jesus, whose life is marked by obedience and faithfulness unto death. That's what full humanity looks like.
But that only was able to occur because Jesus chose that role.
Mm-hmm.
That's that question of agency. Am I going to choose to allow the extraordinary act of intimacy that is procreative?
Hmm. This has been good. You know,
I
what we should do? We should just have a weekly lectionary conversation.
Great.
You show me yours, I'll show you mine.
Great. I'm ready.
I think that would be fruitful for people.
And look, I can send you what the quote Torah portion Yitro is, the actual chapters and what have
Yeah.
you. But I would again ask people to go at least in attempt to find a quote English translation from the Hebrew, not to look at what their translation of the Old Testament is.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I've been Robert Alter's Psalms.
yep. And he
really...
did a translation of the entire Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, it's expensive, but it's really well done.
It is. It's yeah, but you can get the Jewish Study Bible, Oxford Second Edition, which has extraordinary commentary, the most up to date English of the Hebrew.
Well, you heard it from Rabbi Joseph. If you're listening to this, you should cancel some OnlyFans subscriptions and buy a copy of the Bible.
Yes, what a trade-off. Do you think Anora was good, Jason?
Yes. I thought it was well made. I thought I can't remember his name. Igor? Was his name Igor? I thought Ivan. I thought that actor did a really good job with very few lines.
Oh no, Igor, you're correct. The quote, the oligarch's guide. Yeah, I think so too. With his face. Yes.
Yeah, and I thought, I thought the end. I thought the whole everything counted on the end of the movie.
No question. I thought Emilia Perez, which has the most absurd possible narrative framing, was daring, and I enjoyed it.
I haven't seen it.
And
now it's like embroiled in controversy.
Yep. So lots and go see. We'll talk about it. I'm Still Here, the Brazilian movie about the military regime.
Okay.
It's a wonderful movie.
All right. I'll see you next week.
Wednesday, Thursday?
Let's do Wednesday.
Let's do Wednesday.
Good to see you.